Hi students, Mr. Halpern here. This is going to be a conversation about population, and we're going to start with the central case study of China's new two-child policy, and whether or not it's going to help the, quote, time bomb. So a little history. So the People's Republic of China is the world's most populous nation. It is home to 1/5 of more than the 7 billion people on Earth. And this started when Mao Zedong's leadership began about 6 decades ago. And at that time, he wanted to improve food production, and population in China was swelling. And so, with a population that had 5.8 children per mother or per woman, they were facing a crisis. And so they decided to institute a new policy that you couldn't have more than one child. And the program began by encouraging people to marry later and to have fewer children. And in 1979, it officially became a one-child policy limit per family, where you had rewards and punishments. And that was 1979. And so this one-child policy program applied mostly to families in urban areas where it was densely populated, and many farming communities were exempt because they needed more people on the farm to farm. And the nation's growth rate just plummeted, went from 1979, at 5.5 children down to 1.7 children for women. So huge decrease in a relatively short amount of time. And so it caused some problems. It caused some problems in terms of shrinking the labor force. And we have an increased number of elderly in that community with few people to really take care of them. And it also caused some gender discrimination, and more girls were aborted as a result of this. And so there's an age discrepancy now in the younger generations post 1979. So in October 2015, it became a two-child policy, and they were allowed to have 2 children without penalty. So this is an example of how countries are really thinking about population as it impacts not just food, but the environment and the economy, and how this is very complicated, and it depends on the current state of the country and what kinds of imports and exports they have, what their overall GDP is. And then it also tries to predict what the country could be. So if, for example, India is going to have a third of the population getting electricity and using cell phones in the next 10 years, how is that population going to be changing? How's their economy going to be changing? And how is the overall population growth rate changing because of that? So a little bit of background. So the human population is growing rapidly. It's now about 7 billion, and it grows about 88 million people each year. That's just a staggering number. And our unprecedented growth is considered to be exponential. As you can see in the graph to the right, you can see the exponential growth right there. Also, in the next 5 years or so, India's population is going to overtake China's, and that's largely because of the one child, now two child policy. So the annual growth rate is 1.2% for the population, and every 58 years it doubles. And so is this a problem? Well, one of the things that we, as we said, is that we have largely technological innovations improving sanitation, better medical care, increased agricultural output. But these improvements have particularly reduced the infant mortality rates and the frequency of children dying in infancy. So this has increased the population size. However, a British economist way back, right at the time when Charles Darwin was coming up with his theory of natural selection, actually Darwin used Malthus as an example of the scarcity of resources and a large population. And Malthus warned that eventually we'd get to the point where we'd run out of resources. And so we've been warning about this for a long time. Interestingly, as we get close to the world food shortages, for example, in the 1940s and 50s, when the population was just starting to boom, we've also been able to innovate, and that's helped us survive for a good amount of time. So a population has steadily increased as a result. So there's a way of looking at this where in the cornucopian view, economists believe that we will just continuously have resources. We will always be able to find new resources, or technology will help to save us. In contrast, environmental scientists recognize that not all the resources can be replaced, like fresh water and melting ice caps and the diversity of life on Earth. And so we tend to look at, as environmentalists, tend to look at something called the IPAT model. IPAT model represents how our total impact is indicative of three things: the population size, the affluence of that population, and the amount of technology that the population has. And typically, as affluence and technology goes up, it has an overall impact on the environment, and typically negative impact on the environment. A fourth factor or variable that impacts the environment is how sensitive the environment is. And some environments obviously are more sensitive than others. For example, the rainforest, for example, is much more sensitive. And also certain environments or habitats like salt marshes and others that are considered in-between biomes, called ecotones, are much more sensitive. And so impact is generally boiled down to specifically a couple of things: pollution and resource consumption. So polluting the resources that we have, and in general decreasing the amount of resources. And so technology is a complicated one. It increases our ability to access resources, and but they also help to increase efficiency and alleviate strain on resources. Moving on to bullet point number 3, Roman numeral 3, demography. Demography is the application of population ecology, and looking at populations from the statistical standpoint. So if you look at our population as nothing different than any other population of organisms, we too have something called a carrying capacity. And a carrying capacity is the number of organisms or individuals that can survive given the limited resources that we have, whether that's food, water, shelter, reproductive mates, whatever. All of those things can combine to a limit or a capacity for a species. And interestingly, with humans, we've been able to increase our carrying capacity while developing technology to overcome the natural limits of our population growth. And so conservative estimates say that our carry capacity is 1 to 2 billion, meaning that we're well above our limit and that we're just essentially going over the amount of resources that we could use sustainably. And some people have also said that we could live with 33 billion people, where we'd have extreme poverty and intensive cultivation without any real wild natural areas. You can imagine how depressing that worldview would be. So demography is really a study of human populations. And how do we study a population? How do we determine it? Well, its size, how dense a population is, so how close in proximity in terms of space, what the distribution is. So in an area, where are the pockets of individuals? Usually it's around urban settings. We can also look at a population in terms of its age structure. So age structure is, where is the population in terms of age? Are they more in the 0 to 20 age group, or is it 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80? And then finally, male to female ratios. And then we can also look at the change over time by looking at the birth and death rates, as well as immigration and emigration. Those will also determine the overall number of individuals in a population. So population size is the absolute number of individuals. And as we said, the distribution can be clumped like in urban settings, but typically it's uneven over the planet. We just recently crossed over a threshold in 2005 where a majority of the people on Earth became more urban. So we crossed a 50% threshold. Before, more than half of the population was rural. And so it indicates our trend in economy and our trend in jobs and also our trend in human interest and also technology. And so the way in which we can look at the population is many ways. As you can see that we have a pie chart there of total number, but also we can look at population in terms of age structure diagrams as well. And they'll show, as you can see below, age structure diagrams show the relative number of people in different age groups. If we have a large number of individuals at the young age group, that typically means that there's a great deal of reproduction. There's a high fertility rate. We can also see from an age structure diagram the ratio of male to female. So if you can see over here, for example, in this population to the right, you see a slightly larger number of males versus females. And this is an example of populations in Canada. And so, it begs a lot of questions. Why? Because it should be a 50-50 ratio just on genetics alone. Population change results from birth, death, immigration, and emigration. So birth and immigration obviously add individuals, and death and emigration remove individuals. And it's important to note the slight difference, immigration versus emigration. And so immigration and emigration play increasing roles, important roles in populations and how they change. In recent times, the Syrian refugee crisis has really changed the population size of the United States and also of neighboring countries of Syria. particularly in Europe. And so that will change all sorts of things, how we use resources, how we think of jobs, and how we think of society as well. Total fertility rate is the number of children per woman over a lifetime. And as we said in class, 2.1 is the replacement fertility. What that means, it's the number of children that a population needs to have in order to create a stable population size. 2.1 is, the 0.1 is for premature death before reproduction. So in a population, accidents happen, people die for unfortunate reasons before birth, before reproduction rather. And so if we just had two, in other words, if we were just replacing a mother and father with two kids, two children, actually the population would decrease. And that's because there's a small chance that the children they have will not make it to reproduction. Some populations have a total replacement fertility that's higher than 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 3 even, and that's an indication that there is more infant mortality in that population. And there could be an increase in disease or just in terms of safety, lack of safety in that population. Typically with industrialization and improved women's rights, equality in healthcare, total fertility rate, or TFR, goes down. So many nations are experiencing transition, and you can see that transition as you look at an age structure diagram. But in order to really understand the transition, we often look at something called the demographic transition model, which depicts the birth and death rate as a line. And different countries are in different stages. You want to be able to know what the characteristics are for each of those different stages: pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, and post-industrial stage. So make sure that you study that a bit and understand the different stages. It's important to note the demographic transition is a universal process, and sometimes you have a stagnation. In other words, you can stay in a certain stage. And a lot of countries in the last 200 to 300 years have developed and moved through, and yet others have stayed in their respective stage for a very long time. The impacts of a large population in the developed world or developing world is called the demographic fatigue, where you stay in a stage because you're not able to move either economically or culturally some of the norms and patterns that have been created. Whether developing nations pass through demographic transition is one of the most important and far-reaching questions for the future of our civilization and Earth's environment. That's a huge and important task. All right, so we're going to pause there and say that's enough for notes. Take care.